If you're any bit familiar with RBY, then chances are you're familiar with the big three. Three overused Pokemon which are so powerful and so integral to the metagame that they're basically required on every single serious team. Tauros, Snorlax, and Chansey. Now obviously no one's gonna break into your house and kill you if you don't run them, but like, just fucking run them, okay? They're really fucking important. However, what if I told you that RBY has another big three? A group of 3 Pokemon that were so powerful that they all ended up getting banned. From Neverused, but like, they're trying, okay? So like, if Mewtwo and Mew are war criminals and Lapras is like a criminal, these guys like, I don't know, they didn't do their homework or something like that. They're fucked up, trust me, okay? Today, I want to talk about the 3 Pokemon on the Neverused Banlist. Golduck, Poliwrath, and Raichu. All 3 of these Pokemon were in Neverused at some point, but ended up getting banned for just being too powerful for the metagame, and having overall a profoundly negative effect on it. And unfortunately, they didn't really stick in Underused. They do have a place in the tier, but, you know, if they had a better place in the tier, they would actually be underused Pokemon and not chilling out in NUBL. Now, one thing I'd like to clarify before I focus on these 3 mons in particular is that I just want to talk about Pokemon that were specifically banned from Neverused. There are Pokemon that were in Neverused and rose up to Underused just by being used in Underused, such as Venusaur and Aerodactyl, and they're kinda different. I don't really want to focus on that. It is worth mentioning though, that Venusaur in Neverused could be a thing again at some point. It is ranked 13th on the viability rankings, but those viability rankings were composed before Sleep got banned from RBY/UU, and it doesn't look like Venusaur is eating at all since the Sleep ban, so I don't know, maybe. It could drop back again and then get banned for some reason, but I don't know. Speaking of UU, I will absolutely be touching on what these Pokemon do in UU, because like, that's where you can actually use them now. Like, I'll absolutely touch on what got them banned from Neverused, but, you know, it's nice to know what these Pokemon are up to now. So, first things first, we're going to start with Golduck, and there's actually a few reasons as to why we're starting with Golduck. Most obviously, it was the first of the 3 to get banned, being banned in the pre-alpha days of RBYNU. Secondly, it was the only one of the 3 to be quick banned. It was, at the time, much more problematic than the other 2, and had absolutely no business staying in the tier. And lastly, out of the 3, it's unfortunately got the least going for it in UU. See, Poliwrath and Raichu are actually pretty solid in UU. They're ranked at 19th and 20th on the UU viability ranking, which is actually higher than any other Pokemon that isn't ranked as underused. Golduck, on the other hand, is currently ranked at 33rd all the way down in the D rank, barely above shit like Butterfree and Seaking. So, how did it all go wrong for Golduck? Well, in the very early days of RBYNU, Golduck was considered top tier, but not necessarily broken. It wasn't even considered the best mon in the tier. At the time, that title went to Moltres. In this Moltres-centric metagame, Golduck was just a good-ass Pokemon. It had relatively good stats, and it was very scary if it set up an Amnesia, but setting up that Amnesia was relatively difficult, so it was fine. However, things would change with the discovery of Arcanine in RBYNU. See, at the time Arcanine hadn't been explored all that much, but it was discovered that if it ran Rest, it was actually a really good answer to Moltres. And on top of the Moltres matchup, Rest just allowed Arcanine to beat a lot of Pokemon that it previously struggled with, such as Blastoise. In response, these Pokemon also started to run Rest, and this is where things take a bit of a turn. You see, now RBYNU was in a state where you had multiple Pokemon on each team running Rest, and while Rest is a great move, it's kinda notorious for giving your opponent amazing setup opportunities. And if there's a Pokemon that benefited from setup opportunities, it's Golduck. Now, setting up an Amnesia for Golduck went from fairly situational to free as fuck, to put it lightly. The Neverused tier was already pretty starved for answers to a +2 Golduck, which was fine in the past when getting to +2 was relatively difficult, but now that it was just kinda free, that was a bit of a problem. Your best option was arguably Venusaur, which was still in Neverused at the time, but even that wasn't a super consistent answer. Razor Leaf's guaranteed crit did bypass any amnesia boost that Golduck had, but it would never one-hit KO Golduck, and that was a massive problem because Golduck is faster than Venusaur and could 2-hit KO it with either Ice Beam or Blizzard, with a +2 Blizzard doing a minimum of over 80% to Venusaur. Unfortunately, a lot of the time, your best answer to Golduck was your Golduck, and it led to a lot of situations where you had two +6 Golducks facing each other down, praying that one of them would freeze the other. And that kind of sucked, so Golduck ended up getting quick banned. Like I mentioned earlier, Golduck's adventures in UU haven't been entirely successful. It is the fastest user of Amnesia in the tier, and that's a nice trait to have, but unfortunately it matches up pretty poorly against a lot of the tier. Golduck's good coverage is wholly unremarkable in Underused, where there's a ton of bulky water types that just don't really care. And also, it has an absolutely horrendous matchup versus Tentacruel, which outspeeds it and bullies the shit out of it with Rest. You might be wondering if Poliwrath has the same issue because it's also a water type Amnesia user in UU, and the answer is kind of. Poliwrath has some options to bully Tentacruel that I'll touch on later when I get to, Poliwrath. And there's also the fact that, unlike Golduck, Poliwrath actually has more than one set that's worth running. Golduck is not only extremely flawed in Underused, but it's extremely predictable. It does one thing, and it's not the best at that thing. Also, unlike the other two Pokemon we're going to be talking about today, Golduck is not on the Overused viability rankings. It's not useless in Overused, but it's definitely a bit worse than the other two options you have. So, yeah, things really aren't shaping up for Golduck. That you hate to see it. Next up, I want to talk about Poliwrath, a former UU Pokemon who dropped to NU to bully the shit out of everyone, who bullied everyone a little bit too hard and got banned to NUBL, where it's now, solid in UU. With that being said though, its place in UU is a bit up in the air now, but we'll touch on that in a bit. Poliwrath was banned from Neverused for pretty similar reasons to Golduck. It's an Amnesia user that gets a lot of opportunities to set up and is very, very hard to stop when it is. Now that might seem kinda strange, but you do have to keep in mind that Golduck and Poliwrath were never in Neverused at the same time. While Golduck was tearing up Neverused, Poliwrath was actually a UU Pokemon, and it dropped to Neverused after it was banned. Now a lot of people were concerned whether it was going to be like Golduck 2, and the answer was kinda. While Poliwrath was very oppressive in a similar way to Golduck, it wasn't as oppressive as Golduck. Golduck was faster, it was harder to stop, but that doesn't mean that Poliwrath wasn't a problem. It absolutely was. At +2, Poliwrath not only hit incredibly hard, but it took hits quite well as well and was very hard to stop. Two of the tier's most notable special attacks at the time, Mr. Mime's Psychic and Raichu's Thunderbolt, despite being super effective, aren't even a guaranteed 3-hit KO on Poliwrath if it has an Amnesia up, which is horrifying to think about. It was also decently physically bulky as well. Despite being super effective, Pharaoh's Dropek wasn't even close to a guaranteed 2-hit KO, and again, if it had an Amnesia up, Poliwrath's Blizzard was a 1-hit KO. Now like I said, Poliwrath was never really as much of a problem as Golduck. It was pretty significantly slower, and it had a largely entirely detrimental fighting type. However, it was still really fucking good, and on top of being really fucking good, it had a suffocating effect on team building. See, just like Golduck, one of the best opportunities that Poliwrath had to set up an Amnesia was the opponent using Rest. Because of just how prevalent Poliwrath was at the time, you really didn't want to run Rest. But if you didn't run Rest, okay, you're not giving Poliwrath as much opportunities to set up, but now your team just gets wiped by offensive teams. There's really no winning, and you just kind of turned into hyper-offense hell. And there's also the fact that people were running some really silly shit in a desperate attempt to stop Poliwrath. Fucking Weeping Bell had a niche in the tier. That's a sign shit has gone too far. For these reasons, and technically another reason that I'll kind of touch on when we talk about UU, Poliwrath was banned in April 2021, and absolutely no one was unhappy about that. Here's where things get a little bit peculiar though. See, after getting banned from Neverused, obviously Poliwrath ended up in UU, and I mentioned earlier that it's pretty solid. If you look at the viability rankings right now, it's at 19th. It's the highest ranked Pokemon that isn't a UU Pokemon, and that seems great. However, that viability is very much up in the air at the moment, and I'll tell you why. As a water type in UU, Poliwrath had a lot of competition. Obviously the best Pokemon in the tier is a water type, that being Tentacruel, but even outside of that, there's a lot of other good water types. Vaporeon had fantastic bulk, Omastar had a great typing, Gyarados was scary as shit. So because of this, Poliwrath needed something unique to set itself apart from the other water types in the tier, and up until recently, it had that. Poliwrath has a lot of unique tools. Stab Submission is occasionally nice, and Earthquake is a great tool for smacking Tentacruel. You might remember I said that that's something Golduck really struggled with, but for Poliwrath, not so much. However, the issue with Poliwrath is that its best unique trait was Hypnosis. It was pretty good in Neverused, but in UU, this is really what let Poliwrath shine. It was really good and made a lot of matchups where Poliwrath was usually fucked quite scary for the opponent's Pokemon, such as Tentacruel. However, as I mentioned earlier, Sleep is now banned in RBY UU, so it can't run Hypnosis anymore. Losing Hypnosis is a big hit for Poliwrath. I mentioned earlier that it had 2 sets, and that was like a big advantage it had over Golduck, which was very, very predictable. I don't know if that's really the case anymore. Like before you had to worry like, oh, is this an Amnesia Poliwrath? Is it a Hypnosis Poliwrath? What if it's running both? Yeah. No, yeah, if you find one now, it's probably Amnesia. Poliwrath has a pretty uncertain future in UU, and I gotta be honest, I don't know how well it's gonna turn out. Although, if there's one little bit of solace for Poliwrath, Poliwhirl is a great Pokemon in Neverused. It's top 5. So yeah, Poliwrath is in a bit of an awkward spot, but their little fella is doing just fine. You love to see it. Also, I have mentioned this before, but it's been a long ass time. Poliwrath does have a niche in Overused as an Amnesia sweeper. It's significantly faster than the other 2 main Amnesia users in Slowbro and Snorlax, and while it does have some unique traits that make it potentially attractive, it's got a lot of flaws too. Starmie and Alakazam are really, really tough matchups that ideally you shouldn't be trying to tackle with Poliwrath. You want to deal with that beforehand. And also, both of its stabs are quite unreliable, because you need the extra power of Hydro Pump, and Submission is Submission. Also, keep in mind that these are things that Poliwrath struggles with after getting a boost. Getting a boost in the first place is not the easiest thing in the world. Poliwrath is not a very consistent mon at all, but like, if you're using it, consistency isn't probably your main concern, so fucking go for it, I guess. Lastly, we have Raichu, who is another UU Pokemon who felt like dropping down to Neverused to scare the shit out of everybody. For a start, Raichu was pretty notable in the tier because it was one of the better answers to Poliwrath, but even outside of that, it was pretty fucking egregious. Raichu has a ton of incredible traits. There's 2 very obvious things that Raichu has going for it, and those are its speed tier and its coverage. 100 speed is blazing fast by Neverused standards. If you dropped it in Neverused today, it would be tied for first with Charizard and Ninetales. This made Raichu pretty scary to switch in on because even though it doesn't hit that hard, only having 90 special and no way to boost it, if you switch in on it, you're probably taking 2 attacks. And speaking of 2 attacks, it's got 2 very fucking good attacks in Thunderbolt and Surf. The coverage provided by Thunderbolt and Surf alone is ridiculous in Neverused. I've touched on Raichu in OU before, and there it runs into some problems. Like, Exeggutor is the big one. Exeggutor is a really important Pokemon, and not being able to hit it really fucking sucks. But in Neverused, you've got the far less oppressive Execute, and that's kind of the only concrete answer to Raichu. Don't get me wrong, Execute is a great grass type in Neverused, but a factor in that is the fact that it's the only grass type in Neverused. If you want a second grass type in Neverused, you're pretty shit out of luck. You either have to go dumpster diving in PU for Vileplume and Parasect, or you've got to use the non-fully evolved Pokemon like Ivysaur and Weepinbell. If you look at the Neverused viability rankings, there's 20 Pokemon that aren't in Neverused still listed on the viability rankings, and in those 20 Pokemon, you won't find the 4 that I just mentioned. They're pretty fucking bad in the tier. There were some other Pokemon who could sort of answer Raichu, but they weren't super concrete. Dragonair resists Thunderbolt and Surf, but it's also Dragonair, who isn't particularly good in Neverused, and there's also Nidoking. Nidoking doesn't fear a 2-hit KO from Surf, and it can potentially 1-hit KO with Earthquake, but it's not really that reliable. Clefable was also a decent answer because it doesn't fear a 3-hit KO from any of Raichu's moves other than the pretty unreliable submission. But the problem with Nidoking and Clefable is that, like, you really need a healthy Nidoking or Clefable to take on a Raichu. Like, yeah, Nidoking has a 41% chance to 1-hit KO Raichu with Earthquake. That's pretty fucking good, but it's slower than Raichu, so if it switches in, it's probably going to take 2 attacks, potentially 2 Surfs, which does, like, minimum 82%. And there's also the fact that, like, Nidoking is a bulky attacker. That's its purpose. And it's going to want to, like, use that bulk at points in the game, and then take hits. But then later in the game, Raichu's going to come in and it's like, shit, what do I do now? And it's the same deal for It's the same deal for Clefable, right? Clefable is a pretty fucking bulky Pokemon, but it needs to use that bulk at other points in the game to handle shit like the opponent's Clefable or a Mr. Mime. It's just not reasonable to expect to keep these Pokemon healthy throughout a game, specifically for when Raichu comes in the mid to late game. It's just unreasonable. And if you don't want to do that, then like I said, you have to go dumpster diving for shitty grass types who don't really make the cut. So Raichu had a pretty suffocating effect on team building in Neverused. Like, it nerfed the shit out of water types because, like, it's fucking Raichu, big ass Thunderbolt, you know? And, like, every team suddenly needs an execute, yeah, the little eggy fella. Alright, so then suddenly there's not going to be any Golem usage, so like, no Golem, no Waters, everyone's got Execute. Well shit, they just use a fuck ton of fire types. So teams just ended up being like, Raichu 3 fire types and then whatever the fuck. It was really, really dumb, and pretty soon after Poliwrath was banned, also in April 2021, Raichu got the boot as well. And everyone was fine with it because Raichu was an asshole. So, that leaves us with the question, how is Raichu doing in Underused? And the answer is, alright. And unlike Poliwrath, I think it's going to continue to be alright. Raichu does face heavy competition from Electabuzz, who is generally considered the premier electric type in Underused. Electabuzz is a little bit faster and has access to Psychic, but Raichu hits a little bit harder and of course has access to Surf. Raichu's main issues in Underused are mostly shared with Electabuzz, alongside the fact that, like, it has to compete with Electabuzz, who doesn't have to worry about a speed type versus Tentacruel, and has access to Psychic, which is arguably a bit more useful than Surf and UU. It is better than Electabuzz's, but Raichu's 90 special isn't all that impressive. You're not guaranteed to 2-hit KO Tentacruel, and you only get a 3-hit KO against the likes of Vaporeon. On top of that, it's also embarrassingly frail on the physical side, in fact even more so than Electabuzz. Persian outspeeds Raichu and cleanly 2-hit KOs it with Slash, and it can take up to 80% from a non-crit Kangaskhan Hyper Beam, which is pretty fucking scary. Also, while it's better off in the matchup than Electabuzz, Raichu also has to worry about the Dugtrio matchup, which is pretty fucking bad all things considered. Unless you have an agility setup, Dugtrio will always outspeed you and nail you with an Earthquake, and while it's not quite a one-hit KO without a crit, it's pretty fucking close, so you better not have taken any chip damage. Raichu does 2-hit KO Dugtrio with Surf, and that is very notable, because Electabuzz's best shot is Seismic Toss, which is its only consistent 3-hit KO. But even then, the only way this matchup is, like, good is if you have an agility setup and you're at full health. And even then, there's the risk of Dugtrio getting a crit Earthquake, and you just fucking die anyways. That would feel pretty fucking bad, but it can happen. I've briefly touched on Raichu in Overused before, and yeah, it's kinda similar to UU, but the competition is significantly stiffer. Like, Raichu is an electric type with Surf, and in a metagame with Rhydon and potentially Golem, that's pretty fucking good. You get a guaranteed one-hit KO on Golem, and you are very, very likely to one-hit KO Rhydon. Although you wish it was a guaranteed one-hit KO, because it's pretty fucking embarrassing when it isn't a one-hit KO. You can also sort of, kind of, maybe, potentially beat Chansey in quotation marks, because Raichu has access to submission, but like, I don't know how comfortable I'd be relying on that, because like, it's a 3-hit KO, Chansey has recovery, that's a lot of submissions you gotta land in a row. Maybe just stick with Jolteon double kick, I like the sound of that a lot more. Also, recoil damage, I forgot about that. That fucking sucks, dude. The issue with Raichu is that, like, outside of the Rhydon and Golem matchup, it really just doesn't match up to the other two electric types in Overused. Like, Zapdos is a good-ass electric type that can take on Chansey and Exeggutor thanks to Drill Peck. Jolteon is a good-ass electric type who can take on Chansey thanks to Double Kick, and Zapdos thanks to not being part Flying type. Raichu is an electric type that can smack the shit out of Rhydon and Golem, but that's kinda it, and it's missing out on the good-ass electric type part. It really doesn't compare to these two. It doesn't hit very hard, it's frail as shit, and it doesn't have Jolteon's blistering speed. It ties with Zapdos, but like, again, Zapdos' stats are really fucking good. Raichu can potentially work in Overused, but it's a big fucking potentially, so yeah. So yeah, that was a little look at RBY's banned Big 3. Or in normal talk for people who aren't trying to get other people to click on a video they made, the 3 Pokemon on the Neverused Banlist in RBY. So yeah, I hope you found this interesting. It was definitely fun to look into. But yeah, thanks.